Thank you, Tom. So much of the motivation for my talk comes from this chart here, which shows you the size of the deficit as a share of national income over time, and the black line here, which shows you the structural deficit, the deficit that's not explained by the economy having temporary weakness in it. So the structural deficit has reduced dramatically since 2010. It's still forecast to fall over the next few years. Now, reductions in the structural deficit are difficult because they're not coming from lovely above-trend growth. What they're coming from is tax rises or spending cuts. So I want to talk about the risks around that profile for the deficit. And there clearly are considerable risks, and that's one reason why the Chancellor is wise to have some headroom against his fiscal targets. In 2020, he said he wants the structural deficit to be below 2% of GDP. On current forecasts, he's got about £15 billion worth of headroom. Relative to the risks involved in forecasting the public finances over that period, that headroom is really very, very small. And the Conservative Party manifesto says that they want to eliminate the deficit by the mid-2020s, a much vaguer target to the previous commitment to eliminate it by 2019-20. But you can see from this chart it's going to be very difficult to do so. Not only will it require reducing the structural deficit for a squeeze on spending over the next few years to 2022-23, but also if these forecasts are correct, there'll be more to do, more tax rises or more spending cuts needed to deliver that outcome. So the deficit is forecast to fall from just over 2% of GDP this year to just under 1% of GDP in 5 years' time. Tom has told you that debt is falling, but it's not falling by very much, and it's still twice its pre-crisis share of national income. So that's clearly a challenge. There are substantial economic and policy risks around this forecast. Even if this forecast through to 2022-23 is correct, eliminating the deficit will be extremely difficult. Now, we shouldn't get too fixated on that target. Bluntly speaking, history suggests the target won't be met and will continue to run deficits. But regardless of that, the UK public finances face substantial pressures which we really should be trying to address. There are weaknesses in the tax system. Are we going to get serious about tackling them, or are we going to continue to allow a suboptimal tax system to operate going forwards? And one thing we can't duck forever is the pressure on public services from an ageing population. Given that the population's ageing, that puts a lot of pressure on the health and social care budgets. It may well be better to try and tackle those problems sooner rather than later. Okay, so focus a bit more on some of those risks. One of the key risks to any forecast for the public finances is that the economy won't turn out to be as big as you expect. So to quantify that a bit, if the economy turns out 1% smaller than we expect, it means the deficit will be about 0.5% of GDP bigger. So a 1% smaller economy, that means there's £20 billion less being generated in the UK economy. It means that the deficit will be about £10 billion greater. It's not just the level of growth that matters, the composition of that growth matters too. Some activities are taxed more heavily, some are taxed less heavily. And several taxes are incredibly reliant on a relatively small number of people for a lot of revenue. And that phenomenon has actually been increased by reforms that we've implemented over the period since 2010. So it's now more true of income tax, of capital gains tax, of inheritance tax, and of stamp duty land tax. We've made all of those taxes more progressive. Now, there's good reasons to want more progressivity in your tax system, but it does pose a challenge. So, for example, we're now in a situation where 56% of adults pay income tax compared to 2/3 of adults 10 years ago. And it means that the revenue forecasts are now very, very sensitive to the performance and the behaviour of a small number of people who happen to be relatively rich people. So 1% of income taxpayers are now delivering 28% of our income tax revenue. So this makes forecasting the public finances more uncertain. You've got a relatively small number of people that you're relying on for a lot of your revenue. And some of those people weren't actually born here. If we look at the people in the top 5% of the earnings distribution, so they're people who earn over £66,000 a year, we can see that 5% of EU citizens in the UK who are not UK born are making that top 5%. So there's a lot of them in the top 5%. And if you focus on the EU 15 countries, they're actually disproportionately in the top 5%. So it's very, very important that those individuals, and in particular those jobs, don't relocate elsewhere post-Brexit. Another challenge for the public finances has been what's been going on in the labour market in recent years. So since 2008, over the last decade, 40% of the growth in the workforce has been because of an increase in self-employment and an increase in the numbers of people who are working for their own company, as opposed to people who are employed in a more conventional way. Now, these activities are tax advantaged relative to the way the tax system treats employees, and the current costs of that to the taxpayer is in excess of £10 billion a year, and the trend is forecast to continue. So by 2021-22, that forecast cost to the tax system is forecast to increase by nearly £5 billion. Now, this is something that we should be trying to tackle, and the Taylor Review did recommend a closer alignment of how standard employees are taxed with how the self-employed and how owner-managers are taxed. Now, the Chancellor has replied to this, and this is what he said. You don't need to read the full quote. I think the key bits are now highlighted in red. While we agree, we have no plans to revisit this issue. So the Chancellor clearly doesn't disagree with this, this finding, but he's either unwilling or unable to do anything about it. You know, if this workforce trend continues, that public finance cost is going to continue growing even further, and the OBR figures show it growing right through to the middle of the 2020s. But as it grows, more people are benefiting from it, and it may well become politically harder to do anything about. I mentioned Brexit earlier, and there's clearly considerable risks around Brexit for the UK economy and for the public finances. Now, the OBR has not updated its assessment of what the UK's decision to leave the European Union will do to GDP or the public finances since its initial November 2016 assessment. And in that, they said that the economy in 2020 would end up about 2% smaller than it would otherwise have been, weakening the public finances by £15 billion. Now, if you're paying attention, you'd have noticed just a moment ago I told you 1% of GDP will hit the deficit for 10 billion. So why is 2% only hitting the deficit for 15 billion? It's because the composition of that hit is very favourable to the public finances. It's not as bad as what we might have feared, at least in the near term. So there's clearly a risk that that will unwind over the longer term, and the public finance effect will in fact be a bit bigger. It's important to stress, however, there's a very large degree of uncertainty around this precise number. And indeed, recent analysis that was leaked from Whitehall looked at different scenarios for Brexit, not the smooth transition that the OBR is assuming. And they looked at, in particular, a hard Brexit scenario in which they suggested the economy could end up 8% smaller in the long run. Now, that is, in fact, consistent with other estimates that have been produced outside of government. But again, I should stress those estimates are very, very uncertain. And there is a potential small amount of upside risk with the way in which the Brexit event has been dealt with in the public finances. There's a small upside risk there. And that relates to the flows of money that we hand over to the European Union each year. So what the OBR is doing in its forecast is it's assuming that we continue to contribute the same amount as we currently do or would have done had we stayed in, or if we don't spend that same amount on money for Brussels, we choose to spend it domestically, for example, on the NHS. Now, given the data that the OBR has on the actual terms of the divorce settlement, there may actually be a small margin that's building up over time, which the UK government could choose to spend on different items domestically, or it could choose to bank. If it were to bank the money, the amounts are about £3 billion in 2020, rising to nearly £6 billion in 2022-23. For those who prefer these numbers in pounds million per week, it's about £60 million, rising to about £120 million per week. But it's important to stress here that while those effects are nice to have, the public finance impact of a weaker economy is highly likely to dominate. The £15 billion hit at the top of this slide is much bigger than any saving from the fiscal flows to the European Union. And the final economic risk I want to highlight is interest rate risk. So Tom showed you that public sector net debt has increased, has doubled since the start of the financial crisis and is now only falling very slowly. If we look at debt interest spending as a share of GDP, shown here on the right-hand axis, you can see that that hasn't doubled. That's because the government's able to enjoy the low cost of borrowing at the moment. And in fact, the debt interest payments are running at a similar level of share of GDP as what they were before the crisis hit. Now, one thing that the Chancellor didn't dwell on in yesterday's statement is because interest rates are now forecast to rise a bit more quickly than they were in November, that debt interest bill is now a bit higher than what we previously thought. It's about £2 to £2.5 billion a year more than what was thought just 4 years ago. And that highlights a risk that we now face. We've got a lot more debt, And because of the way in which the Bank of England's quantitative easing programme is scored on the public finances, we're also extremely exposed to increases in short-term interest rates. So if, for example, the Bank of England base rate goes up by 1 percentage point more than what is forecast, that would add £5 billion a year to debt interest spending and therefore to the deficit. So that's a consequence of having more debt and having more debt that's vulnerable to short-term movements in interest rates. So that's the economic risks I want to talk about. For the rest of this talk, I want to focus on policy risks, reasons why government policy might not turn out to be as the OBR assumes alongside the kind of current government policy settings. And firstly, there's a set of policies which haven't been confirmed as government policy, but you might think are highly likely to happen. The Conservative Party's manifesto commits it to an income tax personal allowance of £12,500 and a higher rate threshold of £50,000 by April 2020. If we want to do that, we estimate now that you'd have to spend £1 billion on delivering the former, and if you want to do both, it would be an additional £0.7 billion on top of that. Tom also mentioned the tradition that every autumn we cancel the next spring's increase in field duties. Actually, the forecasts don't take that into account. They assume that they're going to be RPI indexed every April starting next year. If we do keep to the tradition of freezing the rates every year, that's going to take £3.3 billion off tax revenues in 22-23. And finally, the Prime Minister has announced a review of higher education student finance. It seems highly likely that the outcome of that will be a settlement which is more generous for students, perhaps lower fees, perhaps a lower interest rate. Whatever measure is chosen, it seems likely that they're going to weaken rather than strengthen the public finances. So they're the kind of policies that we would deem highly likely. What about the policies that are already in the pipeline? Are they going to play out as we expect? And I'm going to start by looking at the tax side. So the chart here is showing you the total amount of revenue flowing into the government each year since 1948 as a share of the economy. And the lighter line below shows you tax revenue as a share of national income. So the difference between the two is other revenue the government collects, for example, interest on assets that it holds. Now, regardless of which measure you pick, you can see that they're not really increasing by very much over the next few years. There isn't a net tax rise from measures being planned. The tax changes on average are pretty modest. So you might think there's not much risk that the tax plans won't be delivered as expected. But I think it's worth noting that the tax burden on either measure is at a level which has not been sustained for quite some time. So it will be interesting to see if we do sustain the tax burden at these levels. So in terms of total receipts, we're getting it and keeping it at a level that we haven't sustained since the mid-1980s. In terms of tax receipts, we're getting it to and sustaining it at a level that we haven't managed since the early 1950s. Now, perhaps one way of seeing whether this is likely to be maintained is to look at survey evidence on how people feel about the amount of tax that they're paying. And the British Social Attitudes Survey has asked a question about people's attitudes to tax and spending in relation to spending on health, education, and social benefits. So people are asked, would you like to see more spending on health, social, education, and social benefits with more tax? Would you like to see the same as what we have now? Or would you like to see lower spending and lower tax? And if we look at the proportion who say they want to see taxes and spending about the same, well, you can see that has been dropping in recent years. So you might worry that's because there's a lot of people who want to see tax cuts, and it might suggest that our tax plans are not plausible. But actually, the proportion who respond to this question saying they'd like to see lower taxes and lower spending has always ran at a relatively low level and hasn't shown any signs of increasing in recent years. So what's been going on? Well, the percent of people who report that they want to see taxes going up and spending going up has actually been growing in recent years. So the number of people who say they'd like to see higher taxes and higher spending, well, that fell down to during the 2000s when taxes and spending were indeed growing, but it's been going up since when we've been putting up taxes and cutting spending. Now, you might not like the way the question is asked, you might not believe the levels of these proportions, you might question that, but if you just look at the relativity over time, I think it's interesting to note that the proportion wanting tax and spending the same is back to where it was before the crisis. The proportion who say they want to see higher taxes and higher spending is again back to where it was pre-crisis. So even if you don't like the levels of this, we seem to have put the figures back to where they were 10 years ago. So that's the tax side. I'm now going to turn to the spending side, and I'm going to start by looking at benefit spending. So starting with pensioners, you can see that in real terms, spending on pensioners grew considerably between 1997 and 2017. It's now in a period where pensioner spending is forecast to be relatively flat in real terms. Now, spending per pensioner is actually forecast to continue growing. What's happening is we're increasing the state pension age pretty quickly at the moment. It's going up for women at the moment, and then later this year it will start going up for men. And indeed, once it reaches age 66 for men and women in 2020, October 2020, I believe, it then starts going up again when we stop increasing the state pension age. When we look at working age spending on working age benefits, we see a very different pattern. It grew up to about 2010. It has since fallen, and now it's stable in real terms. So the budget forecasts imply pretty static spending in real terms on working age benefits. As a share of national income, these forecasts imply working age benefit spending falling back to their lowest level since 2002-03. So you might be saying, well, actually, aren't we delivering lots of cuts to the working age benefit system? Why is that line flat if the government is implementing lots and lots of cuts? And the answer to that is that in the absence of any reforms which made the working age benefit system less generous, we would see spending going up. So even with the package of measures in place, we can see growing numbers receiving disability benefits, so growing numbers of children are qualifying for disability living allowance, growing numbers of working age adults are qualifying for DLA or personal independence payments, and growing numbers of working age people are qualifying for carers allowance. So that underlying trend would be pushing up working age spending, and what's happening is the reforms, the cuts, which are making the system less generous than it would otherwise have been, are sufficient to keep spending constant in real terms. And we estimate that if it wasn't for the package of measures that are being rolled out over the next few years, working age benefit spending would have instead have followed this path. So let's look at that package of working age benefit cuts in a bit more detail. And this chart is showing you how much less we are spending on working age benefits in each year compared to what we would have spent had we not carried out any reforms. And the reforms are split between those announced by the coalition government and those announced by Conservative governments since 2015. So the coalition government set out a package of welfare cuts, the biggest of which is the move from RPI indexation to CPI indexation of most working age benefits. Going forward, you can see that the measures that were announced since the summer of 2015 are forecast to deliver increasing savings. In fact, in the long run, we think these are going to save more than the £12 billion that Mr. Osborne envisaged when he set them out. But I think it's very important to highlight that these cuts are coming in pretty gradually. And in fact, of the measures that were announced since summer 2015, only 25% of those savings have actually accrued to the public finances already, or to put it other ways, 75% of the pain that working age households will experience from those cuts are yet to be felt. So who is being impacted by those changes to benefits, and how has the picture changed once you incorporate changes to the tax system? Well, if we look at measures announced since the summer of 2015, and we look at both personal tax and benefit changes, we can see that the effect on incomes overall is pretty modest. Small losses at the bottom of the income distribution, small gains in the middle and top of the income distribution. If we look at the measures that have been announced since the summer of 2015 but are yet to take effect, we see a very different pattern. Those working age benefit cuts working through, affecting those in the bottom half of the income distribution, simply because amongst the working age population at least, we don't pay much in the way of benefits to those towards the top. So that's the overall effect of all of those measures announced since the summer of 2015. And you can see quite a different pattern to what was announced in the last Parliament. So in the last Parliament, the package of cuts was actually a little bit bigger. But a large part of that came from the richest tenth of the population. So while those in the bottom of the income distribution were losing quite a bit from those reforms, it's also the case that those at the very top of the income distribution were also getting hit pretty hard. On average, that's not the case over this Parliament. The measures ahead of us, on average, are hitting those in the bottom fifth of the income distribution really hard and are not hitting at all those in the top 3 or 4 deciles. So what are the welfare cuts and will they actually happen? Well, there certainly are precedents for welfare cuts being announced and not going ahead. Mr. Osborne's package of tax credit cuts in July 2015 and his package of disability benefit cuts in March 2016 were both reversed. One of the big things which is happening at the moment is the rollout of universal credit across the country. There are some people who win a lot from that. There are also a set of people who lose a lot from that. On average, it is less generous than the system it is replacing. And the groups who are losing out include tax credit recipients who own their own home, tax credit recipients who have a lot of unearned income or have financial assets, and tax credit recipients who are self-employed and who report a low income. So they're the kind of groups where you see some particularly big losses over the next few years. It remains to be seen whether the policies will be carried out as expected. So that's benefit spending done. The final thing I want to turn to is spending on public services, and I want to focus on day-to-day spending on public services. Investment spending is being increased. It's day-to-day spending where there's a squeeze. So the chart here shows you, after inflation, spending by central government on day-to-day public service outlays. It's pretty flat over the next few years, declining slightly, but that's challenging to deliver in a climate where the population is growing. So if you look at day-to-day spending after inflation in per capita terms, you can see it's fallen a lot, and it's forecast to continue falling over the next few years. So it's forecast to fall by a further 4%, so £12 billion of extra revenue will be needed if you wanted to prevent any further falls, and that's on top of a 10% decline or a £34 billion cut that's experienced since 2010-11. And you can think about the forecast going forward into two periods. You've got the period up to 2019-20, which is covered by the 2015 spending review, and you've got the period beyond that where no spending review has yet taken place. So the 2015 spending review had settlements right the way up to March 2020, and yesterday Mr. Hammond announced that the next spending review will take place in 2019, and this autumn he will set the spending envelope for that review. So he'll set out how much money will be available for government departments for them to bid for as that review happens in 2019. Now, we don't know how many years the next spending review is going to cover. It's clearly going to include the year 2020-21. One possibility is it covers 3 years. That would see us right through into the next Parliament. It would also cover the period for which the OBR is currently producing public finance forecasts. Now, one possibility is we want to be a bit more generous than the current forecasts allow. Suppose we don't want to see real per capita spending falling by 2% over this period. So we cut spending through to 2019-20, but then we stop. Well, to do that, we'd have to find another £7 billion from somewhere. Or supposing we want to go even further, we want to stop it falling as a share of national income beyond 2019-20. Well, it's forecast to fall by 0.7% of national income. To avoid that, you'd have to top the plans up by something like £14 billion. Even within this, public services would face pressures from an ageing population, and I'm going to talk in a moment about the demographic challenge. But of course, this comes also on top of a desire to eliminate the deficit by the mid-2020s. So it's not the case in 2023, Mr. Hammond has got the public finances in the place he wants them to be. He's forecasting a deficit in that year of 0.9% of national income, which is in £18 billion in today's terms. So it seems rather odd, perhaps, to be talking about spending increases in a climate where the deficit would be greater than what Mr. Hammond would want it to be. Therefore, the tax rises required if you really want to avoid spending cuts and you want to eliminate the deficit really would have to be quite significant. So that's the next spending review. So why might we be talking about the need to top up spending? What are the pressures in public services looking like? Well, the biggest component of day-to-day public spending is public sector pay. And one way in which the government has managed to reduce spending in recent years is through squeezing public sector pay awards. So the chart here is showing you the average difference between public sector pay per hour and private sector pay per hour. So public sector workers on average paid more per hour than private sector workers. Not surprising, on average, for example, they have higher levels of qualifications and more experience. The forecast suggests that that ratio is going to decline a little bit further from where it is today, perhaps making recruitment and retention a little bit more trickier than it is at the moment, and it's putting it back to levels that we've not seen since 2001, 2002. So it looks like quite a challenging environment. And indeed, that probably explains why in last autumn, Mr. Hammond got rid of the 1% pay cap, which had previously been policy, which would have implied this ratio falling to levels that we haven't seen in excess of 20 years. But one challenge for departments over the next few years is that Mr. Hammond has got rid of the 1% pay cap, but they haven't been allocated extra money to pay for what presumably will be more generous pay awards. And we estimate the difference between these two paths totals about £3.7 billion in 2020-21. So that's public sector pay overall. What about individual public service areas? Well, the biggest public service area is the NHS. In the NHS's history, each year, over and above inflation, per capita spending has tended to grow, an average growth rate of 4% per year. And you can see that in the years since the financial crisis, the NHS has enjoyed budget increases, but nowhere near as much as what it had been used to previously. And the current plans going forwards, and assuming the Conservative manifesto pledge to increase NHS spending in 2020 is kept to, you can see that even going forwards, the increases look even less generous than what the NHS has been enjoying in recent years. So the NHS, despite being protected from budget cuts, is clearly not getting the spending increases it's used to. If you look at what's happening in the NHS, you can see that despite this, NHS activity is rising. It's managing to do more, so there's some evidence of efficiency savings. But there's also evidence that it's increasing evidence that it's struggling to meet some of the targets that have been set for it. So one of the highest profile targets is your chances of being seen within 4 hours if you go to an A&E ward. And you can see that back under the Labour era, the target was that 98% of people should be seen within 4 hours. Now the target is 95%, but since 2012, the NHS has been finding it harder and harder to get close to, let alone meet that target. And the final public service I want to look at is the prison service, and here I want to use some excellent data that are pulled together by the Institute for Government in their performance tracker. So the prison spending has been cut by almost 20% since 2009-10, and in part that's been delivered through a reduction in prison staffing. And at the same time, the prison population has risen very slightly. So again, some evidence here of an efficiency saving. We're dealing with the same number of prisoners with fewer prison staff. But if we look at what's been happening within our prisons, we might be slightly alarmed at some of the quality indicators. Assaults on staff, assaults on prisoners, and prisoner self-harm have all increased dramatically, and in particular have increased dramatically since 2012. So it looks like there wasn't a deterioration with the initial cuts, it's the cuts since 2012 that have been associated with these dramatic increases in unpleasant things that are happening within our prison service. This is not evidence of a prison service that's working well. So finally, not a risk for the public finances, a known pressure is demographics. We know that an increasing proportion of the population is going to be at older ages in future, and we know they put greater demands on healthcare, on long-term care, and on pensions. This is a long-run challenge over the next 50 years, but the challenge over the next decade is also pretty significant. So we take the OBR projections from last year. You can see long-term care spending increasing as a share of GDP, state pension spending increasing despite increases in the state pension age, health spending increasing as a result of demographics, and if you add in other cost and demand pressures within the NHS budget, the health budget increasing even faster. So considerable pressure over a 50-year period. But if we just take the decade from 2022, so the decade after where the current forecast period ends, you can still see the pressures are pretty sizable. Just focusing on demographics, there's 0.3% of GDP from long-term care, 0.7% from state pensions, 0.5% from health. That health number changes to 1.5% of GDP if you add in those other cost and demand pressures. And if we don't look even that far ahead, if we say, let's just look at the period between 2022 and the mid-2020s, the target date for eliminating the deficit, there's still quite a lot of pressure. Just from demographics, there's about 0.5% of GDP, or in today's terms, about £11 billion of extra pressure on health, state pensions, and long-term care over that period. Now, one way to deal with this over the longer run would be to move away from the triple lock. At some point, we will have to get rid of the triple lock, but actually in the short term, it won't really make that much difference. And on top of these demographic pressures, it looks like there may well be additional cost pressures within the NHS budget and within the long-term care budget. So finally, I want to talk about some of the consultations we heard about yesterday. This Spring Statement is intended to be, according to the Chancellor, an opportunity to consider longer-term fiscal challenges and start consultations on how they can be addressed. And indeed, we did get some important consultations announced yesterday, which is very welcome, in particular including one on the taxation of digital business, which is a very big and very difficult issue to solve. But there are many other very significant and very politically difficult long-term fiscal challenges ahead. How are we going to deal with those public finance pressures from an ageing population? Are we going to try and tackle the tax system in the context of a changing labour market? How are we going to deal with the fact that revenues from petrol and diesel vehicles are going to decline over the next few years? These do need addressing at some point. So to conclude, the deficit is forecast to fall, currently just over 2% of GDP, forecast to decline to under 1% of GDP in 5 years' time, not because of strong growth, but because of cuts to working age benefits and because of a continued squeeze on day-to-day public service spending. Now, there are considerable risks around this forecast. We don't know how the economy is going to evolve. We know there's even more uncertainty than usual, given Brexit. There are also risks about whether policies will actually be implemented as the government intends. Will we be able to roll out those working age benefit cuts? Will we be able to squeeze public service spending as the government wants? Regardless of whether or not the government achieves its target of eliminating the deficit by the mid-2020s, there are substantial pressures on the public finances, and there are significant and politically difficult long-run public finance challenges that we will need to address. Thank you very much.